Hey everyone, this is my NarraScope 2025 talk, World Building, World Breaking, Designing a GM-less TTRPG Amid Capitalist Ruins, and my name is Nat Mesnard. I'm an indie dev who makes narrative-driven games in Twine, Bitsy, and Unity, including my NYU Game Center Incubator game Band Together, made along with Elana Bell Bogdan, and I am also an ENNIE Award-winning TTRPG designer. Uh, when I'm not making games, I also publish them. And through the TTRPG Press, I co founded with four other queer creators, Scryptid Games. I'm also a game publisher with an interest in platforming marginalized creators and innovative titles that explore non normative relationships and critique normative ones. In this short design talk and postmortem, I'll be telling the story of Assemblage, the world building TTRPG that has been the centerpiece of my design thinking and exploration since 2023. Assemblage is a science inspired eco fantasy TTRPG in which 2 to 6 players collaboratively build the story of an interdependent ecosystem on the verge of environmental disaster. In Assemblage, you use cards in a guidebook to imagine a weird ecology. Then you encounter an environmental disaster and play to find out how and if you survive. In creating Assemblage, I wanted to experience designs, playtests, and even game components that centered in queerness. Crafting a game that reflected my lived experience, needs, and ethics as a non binary person, and contributing to ongoing efforts in tabletop to make our hobby increasingly accessible to newcomers with lower levels of game literacy. So I first encountered the term assemblage in Anna Lowenhaupt Tsing's 2015 published Eco-Anthropology, The Mushroom at the End of the World. In her study of the matsutake mushroom's global economies, Tsing characterizes this rare, highly valued, and ecologically precarious fungus in the ecologies in which it thrives as a cipher for post-capitalist survival. In The Mushroom at the End of the World, she says, precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control even of ourselves. Unable to rely on a stable structure of community, we are thrown into shifting assemblages, which remake us as well as our others. So, what's interesting about matsutake is that they thrive in logged out forests, fruiting best in landscapes destroyed by capitalist economies. This particular organism is one that craves squalor and ruin. So when I read about them in Sing, it occurred to me that their story was incompatible with tales of leftist heroics that simply invert the power roles in Dungeons and Dragons. Not that I mind a good tale of punching fascists from time to time. So just loving this whole direction, I want to give you one more quote from the book. She writes, "We are stuck with the problem of living despite economic and ecological ruination. Neither tales of progress nor of ruin tell us how to think about collaborative survival." So, in taking inspiration from this for my game, my core design question was, what is a tale of collaborative survival that aligns with neither progress nor ruin? And how can play transcend this binary and become something else? Before I started working on Assemblage with that design goal in mind, a centerpiece of my COVID era gameplay had been an online game of Dream Askew, Avery Alder's GM-less role-playing game where players tell the story of a post-collapse queer enclave. Most tabletop role-playing games or TTRPGs, unlike Dream Askew, are not GM-less, right? Dungeons and Dragons, which of course we have pictured here, a scene from Critical Role. Um, D&D is GM full. Players embody individual characters, where then a single game master or GM brings to life the fantasy setting, managing scenes and arbitrating conflict. Here, there is a hierarchy of narrative power and friction between the players and their director king. The GM is what sparks narrative tension. So, in contrast, Alternative, avant-garde, and queer TTRPGs like Dream Askew reject systems of unequal narrative power by staging their gameplay as GM-less. Instead of a film production centered on an auteur director, these games eliminate the game master, making play into something more like an anarchist's meeting. Everyone is equally responsible for telling the story, and games wander off in more chaotic, yet more equitable narrative directions. When I play these TTRPGs, I have noticed that GM-less games sometimes can resemble anarchist spaces in more ways than one. Just like in those communities, in GM-less games, so often a veneer of collaboration and agency obscures the crackling ley lines of power running just beneath the surface. Though there is ostensibly no director king, in fact, someone does often end up in that role. And in each group, everyone knows who it is. Hopefully, it's the most trusted person, right? But often it's the loudest person, the scariest person, or the person who seems to need to be in that role the most. For a long time, I had wondered if it was possible for a game's design to contend with this GM drift, like this tendency I've noticed for groups playing supposedly GM-less games to inexorably fall into redesignating a central director or facilitator. With Assemblage, I wanted a play experience that evoked collective survival in shifting, compromised landscapes, and I wanted a feel of storytelling that evoked multi-species ways of knowing. Instead of looking at human systems, I wanted to look at ecological systems, and I wanted to map the social roles that I saw arising in games. For example, the role of director king or subject onto ecological roles. And by doing that, cause players to view community relationships both inside of and external to the game in a more non binary, queer, and environmentally complicated way. So, in my design process for Assemblage, I established the following grounds for contending with narrative power as a means to support these non hierarchical themes. First, game facilitators are inevitable. Someone is always going to be holding the game book or the cards and teaching the game. That person is often a generous and necessary contributor to the play space. How else would we learn how to play? There is actually nothing wrong with these people, and though they often end up in powerful roles, their intentions are often not to dominate. They simply want to play and will do anything to assure that play happens. Second, given that game facilitators are inevitable, the game must then acknowledge and contend with their presence. Writing rules that assume the players will facilitate the game together and relying on a best effort redistribution of setup and teaching will simply result in a game that does not acknowledge this natural dynamic. So, if the facilitator is always going to be there, then redistributing narrative power away from them relies on designing a game that makes it possible for them to fall into the role of primarily dictating the story. And finally, for the players who are less likely, for whatever reason, to inhabit power roles, the game should increase their ability to engage in storytelling and play by equipping them with a set of core narrative tools. What can they say when they're in the spotlight, contributing to the story, and how should they say it? Giving players these tools invites participation without relying on pre-established game literacy, which is another common source of inequality across narrative contributions. So, I want to take you through how I answered some of these questions when I was designing Assemblage. First, game facilitators are inevitable. So, the core action of play in Assemblage involves creating an ecosystem of weird science fiction beings based upon shared biological relationships. In the game, each player represents an entire species instead of a single character, and species are created in real time by turns, passing the spotlight around the table. In setting up this dynamic, I wanted to recognize existing power dynamics at game tables, so I created the role of the keystone species. This person initiates the ecosystem creation process, and in many ways, their creativity dictates the biology of the other species subsequently created after that. From an ecological perspective, and I'm going to be a nerd here for a second, the notion of a keystone species is one that, and honestly, this definition just comes from Wikipedia, has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance. So in assemblage, the keystone species is always an ecosystem engineer. These creatures create, change, or destroy environments, exerting their will and their needs upon the world around them. The example I give often in helping people understand how to play this is of a beaver, which is literally an animal that re-engineers the world around them. In playtesting the Keystone Species rule, I was once told I should actually eliminate this card because someone said, this is always going to end up being taken by the loudest person in the room. And I actually resisted this critique because I thought by offering bounded narrative control to that person, my game could actually value the kind of power that emerges from this biology and this sensibility while also contending directly with its influence. There's no getting around the fact that these species exist and they exist importantly. However, they are not the only members of the ecosystem. Okay, so now that we've defined a domain for the game group's power broker, basically, the next focus was to design assemblage so that world building and narration were belonging to everyone. I wanted to make it so that you basically had to violate the rules of the game if you wanted to wrangle total narrative control. Um, this intent is actually already well handled by card-based TTRPGs like For the Queen and its descendant, Women Are Werewolves, where in games like this, drawing a card means it's your turn to talk. This was actually part of why I decided to make Assemblage a card-based TTRPG instead of a zine or a perfect bound book. Cards automatically imply a collaborative turn-taking flow of play, and they put the game rules physically within reach of all players. I also took inspiration in assemblage from Fiasco's style of establishing character relationships, wherein relationship cards are placed like between players at the table. And sitting in those kind of gaps between the players, they help scaffold the creation of characters who share those relationships. But assemblage takes this a step further by making those relationships ecological, which means that they attend not to social relationships, but to biological ones. In practice, this means players must rely on each other to achieve a full understanding of the very bodies of the creatures they're imagining. Since, for example, being a parasite that lives within a larger creature means that you must collaboratively narrate the biological mechanism of the parasitism. In other words, right, you have to kind of negotiate in real time the shared biology that you're imagining. With this being a case, everyone at the table is by design necessary for a complete understanding of the game's world. Okay, so the third and final thing, the game should teach players what they can say and how they should say it. This final design principle contends with building narrative prompts into the game's design. If you think about it, most collaborative storytelling games, and we're harkening back to Dream Askew here, function by way of ask and answer narration. Even in traditionally GM games, the GM prompts the players to narrate character actions. The skeleton menaces you. How does your bard respond? GM-less games sometimes take a more free-form and distributed approach to this call and response. So in Dream Askew's early idle dreaming phase, the game rules instruct players to explore character relationships in exposition until someone explicitly asks to see a dynamic or a moment played out in scene. In assemblage, I chose to create a constrained call and response by providing players with specific narratively delineated prompts. For me, compromising narrative freedom in this way enables other forms of freedom and access. Prompts are an opportunity for designers to offer narrative scaffolding to players with mixed levels, not just of game literacy, but also of fiction writing literacy. What constitutes a scene? What details am I allowed to contribute? When should I stop talking? How do I build a story from start to end? Not every player has an intuition for how to answer these questions. And without that intuition, it's easy to relinquish power and narrative control. Some of the cards in Assemblage also embed key beats in the storyline of the game instead of relying on players to naturally create them. This demonstrates that GMless doesn't necessarily have to mean narratively nebulous. In fact, I grant permission to every game designer listening to this talk to simply put the story you want your players to tell in the design of your game if you want to. TTRPGs can be about sandboxing and freedom, but they can also be about enacting and reenacting a particular powerful story. In my story, I force players to enact a moment of crisis and tragedy because I understand natural ecologies, especially right now, to be defined by cataclysmic change. In practice, my experience of designing and playing this weird little game and its resulting ecological power dynamics has been one of engaged listening. When I play, I notice that I'm not as distracted as in other TTRPGs, where I often find myself secretly planning my next comedy bit or stat allocation while others play out scenes. The creatures people create in Assemblage's squishy and strange narrative space really engage me. I think because I've played a part in shaping them. They have great names too, right? Like we have the crevice cucumber, the moon melter, psychic fungaloid, the sprawls, the king glow jellies, and the sugar cube crabworm. In each game of assemblage, when prompted to do so, the players must decide which of these species goes extinct. The sharp grief I've experienced at the loss of these imaginary creatures is probably the thing that I feel most proud of in Assemblage's design. So, the design question I asked at the beginning of this presentation was, what is a tale of collaborative survival that aligns with neither progress nor ruin? How can play transcend this binary and become something else? In Assemblage, I've answered these questions by witnessing the power dynamics that players bring from outside the table into their games and acknowledging it, and then making decisive design choices in light of those truths. If there's one takeaway from this presentation that I'd like to give to designers, it's that all TTRPGs, not just GMless ones, can do this. And indeed, that game designers, in fact, have an obligation to do so, especially given how directly games, especially collaborative storytelling ones, can contend with exploring our survival, our needs, and our differences as players and as people. Thanks again for listening. That's it. I'm coming in hot right around 20 minutes. I would love if you would like to learn more about assemblage for you to scan the QR code on this slide. A full free version of the game is available on screentop.gg. So please play it with your friends and let me know what you think about it. I hope you enjoy this delightful portrait of me created by one of my game design students. And if you want to talk more about any of the topics I covered in this presentation, please feel free to reach out via email or visit my website. Okay, everyone, thanks for listening.